In Magic, the good cards get all the glory, but there's tens of thousands of cards in Magic, and a lot of them aren't that good, and some of them are hilariously bad. And those are going to be our focus for today as we look at the worst creatures in the history of Magic the Gathering. Number 10, Aeling Leprechaun. A 1-mana 1/1 is about as weak as a creature can be, although as creatures like Esper Sentinel show, it's not necessarily a deal breaker, assuming the creature has a strong ability. So what mighty ability does Aeling Leprechaun offer? When it blocks or becomes blocked by a creature, that creature becomes green. As the rest of the card makes abundantly clear, that's it. It's just green. It doesn't do anything else. While it's theoretically possible to make this ability do something, for example, you could turn a creature green so it can't block your Surge Mare, so you can kill it with a Death Mark. These synergies are so rare and underpowered that, in reality, the ability kind of does nothing. Making matters worse, it's a 1/1. Aeling Leprechaun is very likely to die the first time it blocks or becomes blocked by anything, which means even if the ability did do something meaningful, it wouldn't really be possible to build a deck around the effect because it's a one-shot, not that you'd want to build around it anyway. Oh yeah, and as a green 1-drop, Aeling Leprechaun is competing with some legitimately useful creatures, including mana dorks like Llanowar Elves, Delighted Halfling, and Birds of Paradise, or if you want to go beatdowns, cards like Hexdrinker, Experiment 1, and Alabaster Shepherd. Outside of the meme value in some sort of Lucky Charms deck, there's really no reason to ever put Aeling Leprechaun in your deck. Number 9, Boghuls. In Magic, 6 mana can buy you a lot. It can get you legitimate bombs like Grave Titan, Massacre Worm, or Vein Ripper, or it could buy you the 9th worst creature of all time, Boghuls. For 6 mana, you'll get a 4/1 that can't even block. But wait, it has a clash ability. When it enters the battlefield, if the top card of your deck has a higher mana value than your opponent's deck, you'll trigger this powerful ability and put a single +1/+1 counter on Boghuls. The funniest part is, even if you high roll and win the clash, the end result is a 5/2 that still can't block, a card that would probably still be on our list today, and that only happened about 1/3 of the time. Number 8, Goblin Firebug. Through the lens of 2024 Magic, Goblin Firebug is an almost unthinkably bad card. It's a Grizzly Bear, a 2-mana 2/2, but with a hilariously huge drawback. When it leaves the battlefield, you have to sacrifice a land. If Goblin Firebug was super far above the curve, then maybe the land sacking downside would be worth the risk, but all you're getting is a 2/2 for 2. The thing is, for most of Magic's life, Wizards use Grizzly Bears as a sort of baseline creature. Green was supposed to be the color of the strongest creature, so they refused to give other creatures cards of Grizzly Bear's power level. In fact, it wasn't until 2016's Eldritch Moon that Red got an actual Grizzly Bears in Falkenrath Reaver. In this historical context, Goblin Firebug almost makes sense. You get this above the curve, I guess, for your color creature, but you have to deal with a drawback, which is simply too harsh for it to be worth it. Today, thanks to power creep, Red gets cards like Robber of the Rich, a Grizzly Bear with reach and haste, and one that steals cards from your opponent's deck, or even Ogre Headhound, which doesn't even see play, but it's a Grizzly Bear that's also an equipment that can draw a bunch of cards, so there's no reason to ever play Goblin Firebug. Well, unless you somehow manage to build a deck where destroying your own mana base is an upside, then there might be a reason to run Goblin Firebug, although I'm not sure a deck like that actually exists. Need a Goblin Firebug of your own? Well, you can snag one from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Number 7, Teino Calvary. Original Kamigawa block is known for having some of the worst creatures in the modern era of Magic, thanks to mechanics like Bushido and Soul Shift, which, along with Wizards trying to power down the game after breaking it a little bit with Mirrodin the year before, led to Wizards powering down the base stats on most creatures. But even in this powered down plane, Teino Calvary sticks out for its pitiful stats. For 4 mana, you get a 1/1, which is literally as bad as a creature can be stats-wise, but don't worry, it has Bushido 1, so if it blocks or becomes blocked, it'll grow into a 2/2 until end of turn. But a 4-mana 2/2 is still pretty horrible. Thankfully though, it has an activated ability, which can tap to deal 1 damage to an attacking or blocking spirit? If this ability could hit any creature, Teino Calvary would still be a pretty bad card, but probably not among the worst creatures of all time. But most of the time, this ability is gonna do literally nothing, because your opponent isn't gonna have spirits in their deck. Considering that white gets 4-mana 4/4s with upsides like flying or doubling your tokens, and even these cards mostly don't see competitive play, you could literally multiply the stats on Teino Calvary by 4, and it would still be unplayable. That's how bad the Samurai really is. Number 6, Warping Worm. When you see a reserve list card from 1996 that costs less than $1, you know it's gotta be a pretty bad card, and Warping Worm is hilariously bad. Like Teino Calvary, Warping Worm is a 4-mana 1/1, which we've already determined is a pretty bad starting point, and in some ways Warping Worm is even worse than the Samurai, because it's a Simic card, and green is supposed to get the biggest creatures in the game. The ability on Warping Worm makes it even less useful. During your upkeep, it phases out unless you pay its mana cost again, which means if you want to keep your 4-mana 1/1 around the following turn, it's actually kind of an 8-mana 1/1. The good news is, when Warping Worm does phase out, it gets a +1/+1 counter. How you are supposed to play the card is sticking Warping Worm, letting it phase out a few times to slowly grow into a meaningful threat. But if you actually think through how this works in practice, it actually just doesn't really work at all. Let's say you play a Warping Worm on turn 4. On turn 5, it phases out, and you have nothing at all, not even a Warping Worm to block with or attack with. On turn 6, it'll phase back in and get a counter and become a 2/2. So now it's a turn 6 4-mana Grizzly Bears, and then on turn 7, it phases out again, so you can't attack or block with it. Turn 8, it comes back in, gets a counter, and now it's a 3/3, essentially making it a 8-turn 4-mana Centaur Courser. And then turn 9, phases out, no creature. Turn 10, it phases back in and becomes a 4/4, making it a Rumbling Baloth. That's right. It takes 6 turns, half of them without even having Warping Worm on the battlefield, to build a random forgettable common, when you could, you know, just spend 4 mana on Rumbling Baloth and cut out all the extra steps. Well, there are a lot of +1/+1 counter synergies in Magic. Cards like Hardened Scales or Doubling Season, even if you're doubling up the counters on Warping Worm, it's still not even close to being worth it. Number 5, Zephyr Spirit. A 6-mana 0/6 is already a horrible creature, although 6 toughness means that it's at least a good, if incredibly overcosted blocker, right? Well, not exactly, since Zephyr Spirit's ability happens to be that if you block with it, you have to return it to your hand, which means you might be tempted to spend 6 more mana to get it back on the battlefield, rapidly decreasing your odds of winning the game every single time you cast it. When asked about Zephyr Spirit, Magic's head designer Mark Rosewater said that it was made to be bad on purpose. Actually, it was made to be so bad that even beginners understand that it's bad, so well done, wizards, I guess. Number 4, Primordial Ooze. The idea of Primordial Ooze is sorta cool. It starts off small as a 1/1, but every turn it sticks on the battlefield, it slowly grows. The problem is, it has a truly absurd number of drawbacks. First, it has to attack each turn, which means if your opponent has a blocker, it's likely to chump attack itself to death the turn after it comes into play. Even worse, on your upkeep, you have to pay a mana for each +1/+1 counter on it, or you tap it and take damage equal to the number of counters on it, which means Primordial Ooze is the rare 1-drop that is just as likely to kill you as it is to kill your opponent. Let's say you play it on turn 1. On turn 2, you get a counter, and you have to pay a mana, making it a 2-mana 2/2, but it gets progressively worse from there. On turn 3, you'll have to pay 2 more mana, it'll get a counter and become a 4-mana 3/3, and then on turn 4, you gotta pay 3 mana and make it a 7-mana 4/4, and so on and so forth. I probably shouldn't say have to pay, because technically it's a choice, but if you choose not to pay, you'll take an increasingly large amount of damage each turn, and because Primordial Ooze taps itself, you won't even be able to attack or block with it. If you want a similar card, look for something like Bloodhaul Ooze or Scoop Mob, which work in a similar way, but won't accidentally just kill you. Number 3, Merchant Ship. Back in the earliest days of Magic, flavor was often way more important than power or gameplay when it came to designing cards, and Merchant Ship is the perfect example. It's a 1-mana 0/2, which if you manage to attack with without it getting blocked, gains you 2 life, which is supposed to represent the Merchant Ship successfully delivering its wares. Of course, if your opponent doesn't have an island, then it can't attack because it's a ship, and ships go on water. How would you even sail to your opponent if they weren't on an island? And then if you don't have an island, you have to sink the ship because you'd have nothing to sail it on. If the goal was to design a Magic card that exactly represents how a merchant ship works in the real world, then Merchant Ship is pretty great. If you want to make a Magic card that people want to put in their decks though, not so much. Well, you needing an island isn't a big deal since Merchant Ship's a blue card, so you should pretty much have one by default. Your opponent needing an island means in some relatively big percentage of games, Merchant Ship won't be able to attack at all. And even if your opponent does have an island and you manage to get an attack with the ground-bound, or I guess sea-bound 0/2, you don't even get to deal any damage. You just gain 2 life, which means even when everything falls just right, it's literally impossible for Merchant Ship to actually kill your opponent and win you the game. But hey, at least it's a merchant ship. Number 2, Alabaster Leech. While the entire cycle of leeches are horrible, Alabaster Leech is by far the worst of the bunch for a very counterintuitive reason. It's the cheapest of the cycle. In general, being cheaper and more efficient is good in Magic, but not when it comes to leeches. Alabaster Leech is a 1-mana 1/3, which by itself isn't especially exciting, even though it's technically above the curve, especially for its era. The problem with Alabaster Leech is that it makes every one of your white spells cost 1 more white mana to cast for as long as it sits on the battlefield. The idea of leeches is you get an overpowered creature, but you have to deal with the downside of slowing down the rest of your game plan. The problem is that Alabaster Leech isn't actually overpowered. If it was a 1-mana 3/3 or something, it could actually be a kind of interesting card, but as a 1-mana 1/3, it's mostly a slightly above average blocker compared to other white 1-drops of its era, which simply isn't enough to make it worth staxing yourself out of the game starting on turn 1. Number 1, Wood Elemental. Wood Elemental is basically Magic's original Ent, the forest come to life, but sadly, it's also the worst creature that Wizards has ever made. For 4 mana, you get a creature with power and toughness equal to the number of untapped forests you sacrifice when it enters the battlefield. If Goblin Firebug was bad because it was a self-stone rain that made you lose 1 land, then Wood Elemental is essentially a self-Armageddon if you casted it on turn 4. Think about how this card works. If you have 4 mana and you cast it, you won't have any untapped forest to sacrifice, so it'll just die. Let's say you want to build a Rumbling Baloth, the classic unplayable common 4-mana 4/4. You need to get up to 8 mana, play Wood Elves, and then sack half of your mana base, all to just get a Rumbling Baloth. You might be thinking, well, what if I want to sacrifice my lands? Well, then you have Scapeshift, or Hugh the Entwood, or Reprocess, or Pitiless Carnage, or even Shamatsu the Bloodcloaked, which is also horrible, but at least it lets you sack your tap lands. Outside of the funny old art, there's literally no redeeming qualities to Wood Elemental. None at all. You should never put it in your deck, and if you do accidentally put it in your deck, you should pray to the magic gods that you don't draw it, and if you do draw it, for the love of God, please don't cast it. And there you have it. Wood Elemental is the single worst creature in the history of Magic the Gathering. Looking for even more Magic? Well, check out the video where I ranked all the lose the game cards in Magic, or maybe the one about the worst sets ever made.